we began this evaluation last year. It's part of the program of thematic evaluations that the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office carries out, and in fact it's in a way kind of the penultimate evaluation that we do on the 4-year cycle. So we create a multi-year plan for our evaluations, which we had done back in 2013 to start in 2014, and these are aligned with the strategic plan itself. So UNDP has a strategic plan, and that every 4 years, approximately 4 years, they carry out. We create a multi-year plan to try to extract learning and information and recommendations across the variety of different things that UNDP does as an institution. And that ends with the strategic plan evaluation. When we carried this out in 2014, we didn't actually do it as just one evaluation. We did it as 7 different evaluations. We carried out a strategic plan evaluation. We carried out 5 regional program evaluations. We carried out a global program evaluation and a South-South and triangular cooperation evaluation. And that was just cumbersome and difficult for everybody to get their hands around how to make sense of 7 different evaluations at the same time that were all supposed to be embedded or help to establish what the next strategic plan should be about. So this time around, we decided we would bring these all together into one effort. We started it this last year. We went through a prolonged period back in, June, July, August of terms of reference for it. We set up a team that helped us on each of the different thematic areas. And we then just recently provided an emerging findings paper, which we sent to the executive board, to management and the executive board. We had an informal board meeting last week on that emerging findings paper, and the expectation is that we are going to finish this evaluation by the end of this month, which then goes and gets edited and prepared for the board meeting that comes up in September. Now, what the evaluation is really about is because we've included all of these different aspects, it means it really tries to cover the whole world of UNDP's work over the last 4 years. That's the 3 areas of work which deal with sustainable development pathways, that deal with governance and peace building, that deal with resilience, as well as UNDP's work on gender, both in mainstreaming and in programming. It includes partnerships and how UNDP is forming partnerships both with the private sector, with other entities, and so on. It includes institutional performance and ways that the organization is trying to improve the way it performs or the way it manages across the world. And it also includes a set of expectations on the global and regional programming that's done. And so all of these things are interrelated, and we're trying to not only make sense of it, but also try to identify what are the key points in those areas that we want to talk about. Because if we tried to talk about everything, it would go on for 500 pages. So how do we condense that down to the key areas of interest for the organization and that will help them drive forward to the next strategic plan?
If I may just pick where Alan left, I think given the large scope of UNDP's programs, I think we also benefited by the thematic evaluations we did last year. We did at least 3 evaluations. One was on institutional effectiveness of the organization. The other one was the anti-corruption and addressing drivers of corruption, which covers quite a bit of governance area, particularly public administration related work and civil service related work and anti-corruption related work and accountability and transparency related work of UNDP. We also did an evaluation of how UNDP addressed the issues of disabilities, people with disabilities. So all this was useful, forms the basis for this evaluation. Alan rightly mentioned the enormity of the scope of this evaluation. So what we did was we didn't go the usual, we didn't follow the usual approach of using the four evaluation criteria, that is relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability. Instead, we looked at the broader issues on which we want to talk about UNDP's performance. That is how UNDP enhanced capacity development at the country level, how UNDP approached issues of partnerships, how UNDP enabled coordination of different types at different levels, whether it's global, regional, or at the country level, to what extent UNDP enhanced addressing equity issues, whether it's gender equality or people with disabilities or people who are disadvantaged. So these were the broader issues the evaluation focused on, and the questions that were related, we looked at, were related to these areas. I must say that we followed a very thorough method to collect evidence to substantiate some of our findings and conclusions which we'll be making in this evaluation. We had over 25 country case studies carried out across the 5 regions where UNDP has been working. We had the same number of desk studies, which was a thorough analysis of the existing information. We did also visit the 5 regional centers of UNDP to understand the regional dynamics of UNDP engaging with the regional institutions and regional policy and advocacy issues. We also used about over 125 evaluations to do meta-analysis of evaluations. These are evaluations carried out by the Independent Evaluation Office, as well as the evaluations done by the decentralized units of UNDP. We also had to narrow down some of the areas which Alan just now mentioned, because each of these areas is very huge. For example, sustainable development pathways entails environment, climate change, inclusive growth, poverty reduction, social protection. These by themselves are such huge issues. We had to really pick certain key areas where UNDP could have made contribution or missed opportunities to reflect on the role and contribution of UNDP. Similarly, governance, inclusive governance and peace building has about 30 areas UNDP has been engaging in, and we had to be really focused to make observations on UNDP's role and contribution. And that's not always easy, but we try to identify areas to make meaningful observations of UNDP's role and contributions. This is a very challenging process to condense some of these findings, because it's been there was huge volume of evidence on UNDP's role and contribution. We are in that process, and hopefully we'll have a report that would point to key areas which the organization can act upon.
Yeah, and I think, picking up from Vijay's comments on that, one of the challenges that we face when we're looking thematically or corporately across how UNDP works is that we're talking about an organization with 130 country offices working in 170 different countries. In any given issue, you're going to likely find some evidence of work that's exemplary, and evidence of work that isn't so exemplary, that's having problems. And so depending on where you look, depending on who you speak with, depending on the circumstances and the context in which UNDP is working, you can come up with very different results or a feeling of results of UNDP's work. And so that we find very challenging. Both Vijay and I are doing a lot of the thematic evaluation, so we're typically looking globally across how UNDP is working, and we find, sometimes it's frustrating when you're creating findings of this work, because you say, on the one hand, things are going well. However, there are things that are problematic. And so in this exercise, that's been a real challenge, because you don't want to try to make all of your findings be both positive and negative, or this and the other hand. You need to come up with some issues that are quite relevant for the organization.
Probably we'll be leaving out all the details of it, which are already there in the organization's monitoring framework, in what they call the results data of the organization. We may not be repeating all that, the details of every project, what is being achieved, but focusing much more on the larger areas of contribution or missed opportunities, or areas where UNDP could have done better. I totally agree with Alan. It's not easy to look at a program which with across 140 plus countries, but also projects which have started at different points of time and are at different stages of implementation, and it's not possible to aggregate some of these findings and conclusions to make certain observations. It's not easy. I think this is a challenge for any evaluation which looks at a strategic plan of an organization, to make observations on overall contribution of the organization in a particular area. But I think some observation can be made, considering that the program is going into the third and fourth year, as we will be concluding our analysis and drafting the report. That would be possible, but it be not entirely possible to talk about each and every dimension of UNDP's engagement.
Exactly. UNDP during this time frame has also gone through a quite substantial structural change. And that was a strong push from this administration to move much of its advisory services from New York to the regional hubs. And that has added a further interesting dimension to evaluating, because we're evaluating at a time of change. And so you're looking at projects and programs and what's been achieved, but you also recognize that's shifting. It's shifting because the people are shifting. It's shifting because it takes time to reorganize an organization like this. And we have to take that into account when we're considering whether their results are what we would have expected.
Absolutely. And it may not be fair to make certain conclusions in some areas, because the work is in progress, and some more time need to be given to make any judgments about the actual contribution in those areas. So we are aware about that. We take that on board when we are providing findings and conclusions that some areas it's not possible to give definitive conclusions.
We put together an emerging findings paper that we presented to the board last week. And obviously we had to be selective. We couldn't include all of the different findings, but we covered findings on each of the key areas of work and the cross-cutting issues and so on. Vijay and I, as we put this together, have also taken different areas of that we've paid more attention to. So, for instance, I've been looking very much at the sustainable development pathways and resilience areas of work, as well as partnerships. Vijay has been looking especially at the regional and global programming, at governance and peace building, at gender. And then we had our colleague Ana Rosa, who is also working very much on the institutional effectiveness piece. So in that way, while we're all working on it, we've also had some specialization. So let me speak a little bit then on some of the sustainable development pathways and resilience issues that arose and that we've included in the findings, and then I'll pass it to Vijaya. Sustainable development pathways really takes UNDP's kind of classic work on poverty alleviation, and I think, as many know, when the overarching goal of UNDP has been very much to improve livelihoods, to address the concerns of the poorest of the poor and most marginalized members of society. So that's kind of written into the ethos of the organization, and so we've looked at its social protection programming, we've looked at livelihoods, we've looked at small and medium-sized enterprise development, we've looked at a variety of different ways that UNDP engages. And we've also looked at its work in providing environmental management services, climate change adaptation. They have a whole series of programming on energy, providing energy services. So we looked at each of these areas, and then we tried to condense down to talk about a few different aspects to it. We note that, for instance, UNDP has had a measure of success around the world in working with countries to assist them in their strategies for poverty alleviation. And we note that several years back, UNDP, the Independent Evaluation Office put together an evaluation on UNDP's poverty work, and found that there was not enough attention on the poorest of the poor. Really focusing attention and addressing the segment of society that's the most difficult to reach in terms of how to provide improved livelihoods. And we noticed that last year UNDP went to the board and actually presented the changes that they've been making to their organization to address those issues. And we've noted that there have been some improvements. One of the concerns we've had, though, is that the UNDP is still a little bit too focused on small, micro scale, little jobs here, little work there, and so the scalability and the size and scope of issues that UNDP is seeking to address within its poverty programming, we suggested there's continuing room for improvement. We noticed that there's a whole series of social protection programs that are going on, quite large ones in some cases, where they're really trying to help governments identify how they provide subsistence support to communities. And I think noted some quite positive steps that have happened in places like Bangladesh, in places like Albania, in places like Egypt. My own particular background is in the environmental area, and so it was quite interesting to watch, to see the transformation that UNDP has been making in its environmental programming, which continues to be a very strong and expanding business for the organization. And in particular, activity these days is moving towards what we call climate change adaptation. And that is, as we have increased shocks, economic and climate-related shocks that countries are experiencing, what is UNDP doing in order to help on the prevention side and then also on the recovery side? And climate change brings a new dimension because it means that these crises are slower onset. We may be talking 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line rather than our typical disaster thinking of flooding and earthquakes. So UNDP has really carved out a niche in this business and has been expanding that business quite considerably. So we take note of that, and we also recognize that it provides a very interesting opportunity for the organization in the future in building even greater expertise in that area. That, interestingly enough, climate change is a segue also to the resilience side because it covers both a sustainable development aspect and also a resilience-related aspect. We talk a bit in the evaluation about the fact that UNDP used to have a whole separate global program for crisis prevention and recovery, and then that got merged together with the Bureau for Development for Development Policy (BDP) to create a whole new Bureau for Policy Planning Support. And then there was a kind of a little offshoot called the Crisis Response Unit. And so we've looked at that change in the structure and what it's meant over these last several years in terms of how it provides support on the prevention and recovery after crises, both in conflict and in disasters. And we've recognized that there's a continuing effort that's needed to smooth that transition, to make sure that there's there's a good continuity of program support from the prevention side to the recovery side. So we've talked a little bit about those kinds of issues as well. Maybe that's enough for that. I'll pass it to Vijay. We can talk a little bit about some of the other findings that have come up.
Yes, again, inclusive governance, inclusive democratic governance and peace building, again, is a huge area. I think it's one of the largest areas of UNDP's support, taking over 55% of UNDP's expenditure. There are several areas we looked at within this broad area of support. For example, we looked at UNDP's support to democratic governance, to elections, to parliament, to constitution related work. We looked at rule of law, to justice sector, to citizen security, to human rights policies. We looked at the other area of public administration related work and accountability, transparency, anti-corruption, civil service reforms related work. The other big area of the governance support is basic service delivery. And we looked at that area as well. And within that, UNDP manages this vertical funds, both in environment, Global Environment Fund, but also a global fund related to HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. This is a $1 billion work of UNDP, where it supports countries which are not principal recipients. So UNDP is the principal recipient and does a fiduciary role, and in that process also does the capacity development work. So we covered that area as well. The other big area of UNDP is support to peace building and state building, and a whole lot of governance work, which I was just mentioned. All those areas are also done in the context of post-conflict and crisis countries. And UNDP has a niche in these countries, as an agency which everybody falls back on to get the governments going, to build the basic capacities. So a lot of governance work is done in crisis context. So that's one area we looked at. In the gender-related work, gender equality and women's empowerment, we looked at the progress UNDP made since we did the last evaluation of the gender equality strategy of UNDP, what happened since 2013, how the organization progressed, what was we focused on. Let me just make a couple of points on the governance work. UNDP has a very challenging task in contributing to the outcomes at the country level, because many countries where UNDP carries out its programs have significant public administration challenges. So it's not easy to quickly see results in public sector processes in strengthening accountability and transparency. And also, given that these programs are not driven by core resources, that is, the resources that are mobilized at the headquarters, these are the programs which are driven by the demand at the country level in 140 countries, which we were mentioning earlier. So these programs are not really substantive in all cases. These are smaller programs, but UNDP has this entry point, and to make these contributions to the processes so that the governments can take from there and roll out public administration reforms and other reforms in those areas. In that sense, although UNDP's scale and scope of the programs are sometimes small, I think the contributions are nevertheless very significant. And like I mentioned earlier, these are more important, particularly in the post-conflict context, where UNDP helps the countries, crisis countries, to address some of the drivers of conflict, which are having strong governance processes, which are essential to address issues that trigger conflict. So in that sense, this is a very critical work. But one point I would like to mention here, in addition to all the contributions UNDP might have made, is that UNDP has this advantage of being a very neutral agency, and this is very important when engaging in democratic governance related work, such as elections work or parliament work or constitution work, which is very sensitive. And UNDP is considered a very important agency, and sometimes the only agency which can get into such sensitive areas. But a criticism often that came up during our evaluation is that UNDP sometimes does not leverage its advantage in pushing the countries to negotiating to push for more concrete reforms, rather than just providing the technical support. It can use its comparative advantage to prod countries to speeden up reforms. That's been one of the things which we will be talking about in the report.
We are in the final stages of writing the report for this evaluation. That needs to be completed this month so that the UNDP management have a chance to take a look at it, which is our regular procedure. We finish a report, we send it to them in draft, they take a look and say, and have an opportunity to respond regarding errors of fact or omission, where they say that we think you may have gotten the numbers wrong, or we think that you should have included something. Obviously, they don't have any control over our conclusions and recommendations. Those are wholly our own, and we have the freedom to mention our own views to the board and publicly about what we think UNDP has achieved. So they'll have an opportunity then to take that to give us their comments. There's a next version, there's a next revision to it, which then is tabled for formal consideration by the UNDP Executive Board in September. Now, the UNDP Executive Board meets 3 times a year. So they have a first regular session in January, an annual session in June, and then a second regular session in September. So this will go to the September board. Now, there's a special case this year, because just at the same time that the new strategic plan is being considered, UNDP will have a new administrator. And that new administrator, Mr. Achim Steiner, only comes on board full-time next week, or 2 weeks from now. And so in mid-June. And the executive board, and of course UNDP management itself, wanted to make sure that there is proper time for the new administrator to be able to consider not only the current draft of the next strategic plan, but also our evaluation before the new strategic plan is approved by the board. That means this year, and it's the first time I'm aware of in quite some time, they will have a special extraordinary session of the board that will meet in the beginning of November. And the purpose of that extraordinary session is to consider and then approve the strategic plan. So that means even as we present this evaluation in September, there will still be additional time for the board and management to take it into consideration as they finalize. We've already had some feedback based upon the emerging findings of aspects that they want to make sure are included in the revised strategic plan. So we know already that some of the work that we're doing is going to be taken into account in the strategic planning exercise for the next 4 years. So we're encouraged that there's certainly an audience for what we come up with here. Let me say that it's a very interesting time for the organization. Not only are they finishing up this structural change process and getting a new administrator, but they're also coming at it at a time of a lot of discussion within the United Nations about how these funds, programs, and agencies should be coordinating their work at the country level. And there's a review process, the quadrennial comprehensive review process that goes on. So in every 4-year process that the UN system goes through to try to identify how the UN funds, programs, and agencies should better organize their work. Within that, there's a lot of expectation and a lot of potential repercussions for UNDP in the coming period. So it's an added challenge for us because we're trying to provide recommendations at a time of change for the organization that also may be larger change for the UN system, with a direct relationship to how it works out in the countries. There again, there's some interest and expectation that the recommendations we come up with will also filter into the work that the Secretary General and the UN itself is doing on its development programming across the globe. So we're optimistic. It puts some pressure on us to make sure we get it right, but we're also optimistic people will be listening.
Yeah, but I think there's also quite a bit of lessons for even other agencies who would be taking up such complex evaluations. From what I know, not many organizations evaluate their strategic frameworks or plans. So I think they'll, if we publish the way we went about it, the methodology we followed, or even how we dealt, the approach we used to looking at such complex issues, complex themes, would be of interest, just not to UNDP, to I think to wider agencies. In terms of specific outputs that will be coming out, Alan just mentioned about the synthesis report and the time frame for that. But we'll be also having other reports. For example, we were committed to the board that we would submit a report on regional programs and global programs. There'll be a separate report which we'll be sharing at some point. As we were mentioning, we have lot of data which will be of interest not only to UNDP but also for other UN agencies and other actors who are working in this area. So we may have sub-reports on, say, sustainable development or environment or poverty environment linkages, or on any specific areas of governance or gender equality, which we'll be bringing out in the coming months once we finish the process of finalizing the synthesis report. So there's quite a bit for everybody to look out for. Things emerging from this evaluation. I think Alan and myself and the rest of the team who are working on this evaluation will be in the coming months producing these reports and sharing it on our website. So look out for that on our website. There'll be quite a bit of information coming over.